Good morning. Sorry, good morning, and also to you on online. I'm actually quite happy to be back in a class after a long time, so I find it very stimulating. And it's also great to be able, as UNDRR, to be part of this initiative. So I want to thank you, John, and the University of Canterbury. I want to thank the IFRC and the great work that you have been doing for now long, like 20 years at least, with the IDRL, actually even longer than that, and lead for the great work that you have been doing as well. So for me today is a great opportunity because with practitioners in the room and academics, I think we have an opportunity to really share and brainstorm on some of the important issues that whenever we travel to different countries, we really face, and especially at the community levels where they may not present and discuss things in legal terms, but they present us with realities that do require a clear intervention by different type of normative instruments. And I would like to really share with you some, I would say, 3 points fundamentally today. The first point is on the context. From a normative point of view, there has been, as I said, great work done in many countries, as well as international, under the leadership of the IFRC. And there has been a lot of emphasis on better preparedness and response, which is great. And as we have just heard from the Dean, is something that is constantly needed. At the same time, we do not have an equal balance, I would say, when it comes to prevention. So I think it's very important that as practitioners and academics, we bring that focus on prevention at a much higher and articulated level. From a substantive, or actually not even substantive, from a reality point of view, disaster risk is increasing. In Sendai, where the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference for Disaster Risk Reduction, it was clearly agreed that we were committing to reduce losses and risk. So the fact that risk after now 9 years is increasing is clearly means that something is going wrong. And there are multiple reasons to that, but certainly, as I will come to that point a little later, there is a question also where normative frameworks can really help. The nature of risk has also changed. The expert would call it compounding and cascading risks and disasters. What that means is that most of you and all of you will know is that a hazard normally said that is creating a disaster. In reality, it's not just the hazard, it's also vulnerabilities, and that we go straight to the social economics of things. And but then there are effects of a multiple nature across different fields, across different time frames. And there are a lot of efforts in calculating economic losses, but yet when it comes to calculating indirect economic losses, it's already quite difficult, let alone calculating social impact and losses, and not just after 1 or 2 years, after 5, 10, 15. So when something happens, we all know, and also from a legal perspective, you can't really bring back things as they were before. Hence the importance of focusing big time on prevention. And because the context is so complex, we really need to have all hands on decks. And what that means is that it's not just a disaster expert, let's say, but we really include in ensuring a whole of society and a whole of state institutions engagement. Now, what the Sendai Framework midterm review told us, it was completed last year, there are 2 fundamental problems, and they are no surprise to anyone. First one is a problem of governance, in the sense that disaster risk governance is not as inclusive as it should be and as we agreed to. And that is about the primary engagement of all state institutions. So whereas we know for the moment much of the responsibility is still only on the disaster management agencies, which are busy with responding. But there is a clear role also for Ministry of Finance, Ministries of Planning, Ministry of Social Welfare, and so on and so forth. So that widening of responsibility clearly requires also a normative intervention of different nature. Another one is more on the vertical front, which is about the role and responsibility of local government. And then normally, actually, in many countries, they have a lot of responsibilities, but that responsibility doesn't come with resources. So you also know from a legal perspective that if, no one is bound to do the impossible fundamentally. This is an old principle of law. So you give responsibility, but then at the same time, you don't give the resources that cannot be, therefore, the task discharged. So that needs to be looked into much more. And another component of this lacking limited progress in governance is the sufficient attention given, because there's a lot of efforts going on, but it's not enough in ensuring women leadership and ensuring women engagement at the leadership level, but also at the grassroots levels, how financing can support these groups, attentions to persons with disabilities, attentions to indigenous people, and the list goes on. As I said earlier, is a question of ensuring the full participation, and it's not an issue of simply, nice gesture. It's because of the situations is complex. We really need to have multiple competencies across the board. And we had interesting discussion, for instance, with organizations of persons with disabilities, which clearly has a lot of great ideas on how reduce disaster risk, but still their engagement in political processes, in defining policies is actually quite limited. In essence, it boils down to the fact that inclusive governance is simply smart governance. And unless it is inclusive, we can't really say that we're doing disaster risk reduction properly. Then the other element that came out of the Sendai Framework midterm review is that money is not going where it should. It's a lot of money going for, and rightfully so, for preparedness and response, but the same is not for prevention. And the same story is internationally. According to certain statistics, only 0.5%, as I stress again, 0.5% of ODA is going to prevention. You really clearly understand that is not even, we can't even say that is not enough. It's nothing fundamentally. Then where do we stand? At the domestic level, let me be very blunt, creating disaster risk is still legal. You may have in some situations some good administrative regulations that try to control the creation of risk, but fundamentally there are no consequences apart from some exceptions. The consequences are there when regrettably a disaster takes place, but we know that that is all too late. So the question of strengthening normative framework at the domestic level is really of a primary importance. Obviously, it's not easy to define a clear legal obligation to reduce disaster risk, but precisely because there's a lot of people focused on this, precisely because of the competencies that we have at disposal, I genuinely believe that this is possible. And the same is happening at the international level. There has been great work done by the United Nations International Law Commission, and now there is a draft before the Legal Committee of the UN General Assembly called draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters. That is in that draft articles, there is the first articulation of a legal obligation to reduce disaster risk that has a broad scope. There is another one, which is Article 11 of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but that is lex specialis, one could say, because it's dedicated to a certain field. And there is very important work that the committee is doing precisely in these days. And if you do have an opportunity, please do engage with the committee, because they are preparing this commentary to the draft, to Article 11. And again, there, it's important because the article was drafted, now, what, 25 years ago, more or less. So this interpretation or this authentic interpretation is quite important to bring to bear on its interpretation the breadth of experience and understanding that has been matured by many stakeholders across the globe. But the second point that I want to touch upon is on some of the questions that we can ask, and I hope that with your wisdom and knowledge we can help advance through these couple of days together. Is again, how can we enhance the focus on prevention through different types of normative framework? How we can help the definition of these clear legal obligations to reduce disaster risk. Fundamentally, how can we bring to bear the principle of the rule of law when it comes to prevention, and therefore also making the best and the most also of legal proceedings, I would say. And then later on today, we'll learn a little bit of that. Most importantly, how can we make the best use of the human rights treaties? We do know that behind any situation of vulnerability, you do have a limited, if not a lack of protection of human rights. So we know, as I said, the disaster risk reduction and reducing disaster risk does not have a strong legal obligation at the moment. Sendai is soft law. How can it be strengthened using and making the most use of human rights treaties? And some of them have been ratified fundamentally by all countries. I can think of the CRC, the Convention on the Right of Person for Children, and others. And another point which I think is quite important is luckily science and technology are fast progressing. So what we can say that 5 years ago we didn't know is no longer possible to say today. So the question of due diligence requires quite a fast changing interpretation, because things are really moving much faster than in the past. So when you look at things from a court proceedings, then this is where the assessment of due diligence is done, and this is where science, technology, and innovations comes into the picture. And then fundamentally is then the question of what type of instruments are needed to reduce disaster risk. And it's not just law, we know that, because adopting a law may take many years. And science doesn't wait for that long. So even simply to integrate the progress of science and technology into normative frameworks does require different instruments. So it's really looking at the full scope in each country of depending on the system that exists there, including the courts, what comes out. And then again, there are certain areas probably that require certain specific or dedicated focus, and I'm sure that some of it will come today. Now, the third point that I want to stress is where do we go next? And I'll be very, very short term. The next for me is Manila, and you will ask Marco, what are you talking about? In Manila, there is the next Asia Pacific Ministerial Conference for Disaster Risk Reductions, where we are going to discuss these questions. And this meeting today is very much a springboard to that discussion. So I really hope that you can help formulate some very good policy recommendations that we can bring to the table in Manila. With this, I stop. Thank you, and I wish you enjoy this today.
Thank you, Marco. That was fantastic, as usual. Excellent opening to today's session. I thought your comment on that causing disaster risk remains legal was that I will remember that. I may steal it and use it in my lectures. We've got 5 minutes till the next session. I don't know if anybody has. Marco, would you take a question or? Cool. Well, sorry, I sort of forced you to. Yeah. So any questions? Any questions for Marco?
I think they need some more coffee.
There's more coffee required. I'm going to ask you a question. Yeah. So when you talked about disaster risk being legal, so how you talked about the human rights treaties, but how practically could you introduce those sort of illegality into risk, into creation of risk?
I think that there may be multiple ways to do that. I think what is important is the formulation at least of a general principles in any domestic legal system. That has to be written somewhere. It can be in a constitution, it can be in law, it can be through court proceedings, but establishing a principle that creating disaster risk must have some consequences, because at the moment risk is created and then is transferred. Let me give you a very concrete example. If you're renting a place, wherever you live, whenever you were signing the contract with your landlord, did she or he or the company disclose the risk that your home is affected to? There you go. So you should know, right? So where is that risk disclosure provisions? Somewhere in the system. And for that risk disclosure provisions, you need to have a principle in a domestic framework. So then how that principle is established, again, depends on the country, civil law, common law, then you name it. I think we need to be quite flexible on the form, but the content must be there. There are certain systems, civil law, where you have also administrative law. There are provisions that creating risk is not okay, but the criminal consequences of some of the civil liabilities, they don't kick in until, again, it's too late. If you're dead, you're dead. There's no, or if you acquire permanent or temporary disabilities, it's the same challenge, and it's not just one person, it's a family, it's a community, and so on and so forth. So that's where a much stronger emphasis needs to be placed. And again, I think we need to be flexible on the instrument of the form, but the principle has to be very clear. Yes, ma'am.
Rebecca Donnelly from New Zealand Red Cross. I wonder if you could comment on what good looks like in terms of an outcome from Manila.
I can see two good outcomes from Manila. One is a clear recommendation on developing such a principle for making the creation of disaster risk illegal. And then the second thing is Manila is happening just before the deliberation of, it is a bit technical, I apologize. As I said, the draft articles on the protection of persons in the event of disasters are sitting in discussion in a working group, which is part of the SIX, which is the legal committee of the UN General Assembly, where I personally hope that there will be recommendations to initiate a process to negotiate such a treaty on the basis of the draft articles of the UN International Law Commission. So I think that the Manila meeting can be at least the voice from the Asia Pacific recommending the initiation of such a process, and then in due course the adoption of such a treaty.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Tony Collins aho. My name is Tony Collins. I'm the Deputy Director of the lead group here, the Institute of Law, Emergencies and Disasters. So today we've got the first session, Governing Disasters, Science into Practice, and 4 wonderful speakers. Our first speaker today is Francesca Munerol, and she's talking on understanding, monitoring and managing natural disaster risk through the lens of forensic data.
Good morning, everyone. Even if it's almost midnight here in Italy, My name is Francesca Munerol, and I will tell you something about CIMA Foundation activities on responsibility in civil protection. First, how do we try to understand disaster risk to predict and prevent them? CIMA Foundation is one of the centers of competence of the Italian civil protection. But what is center's competence? Center's competence provide services and information and so on for civil protection purpose. And CIMA is a center of competence of hydrometeorological risk, forest fire, and responsibility. We are the only center on responsibility in Italy. We have a sort of privileged consultants of the civil protection when they need support on laws and on people's responsibilities. Our main tool for understanding how to predict, to prevent, and also to manage disaster risk is the Civil Protection Code, which establishes that civil protection must protect life, physical integrity, property, settlements, and so on. These are called legal goods, interests, assets, and anyone who damages these goods can be punished. The legal assets are of constitutional level, the maximum in our legal system. They can be violated by crimes or by conducts civilly relevant. So we have two trials. Criminal acts can be committed intentionally or negligently by direct action or by omission. But the most frequent category is the commission of crimes due to negligence and through an omission, such as not notifying the population before an event occurs. This is an example. The legal obligation to act is called in our system, in Italian system, position of guarantee. We try to monitor disaster events, journalistic investigation, crime news, trials, and the technical documentation that is produced during trials, and obviously the sentences. These huge materials give us a lot of information about how the disaster happened. We carry out this monitoring through the Wikiprocessi platform. This is a very important point. Wikiprocessi platform is created by CIMA, but for civil protection system and also for researchers. Each disaster has a very detailed fact sheet. You can see these fact sheets. And also attachments. It's unique, I think, in the world, obviously in Italy, but it's a unique product for civil protection, and they use it to understand better what happened during events, but also what happened during trials, and make the decisions on that sentences or fact sheets. Why we use this system? We want to monitor this material because we think that it's fundamental for understanding the disaster, but also to understand the impacts of the law and procedures in the concrete case, to predict responsibilities, and also to prevent future responsibility by changing behaviors. Study the evolution of the jurisprudence over time, and finally to analyze and verify how the parties of the trials reconstruct the system of responsibility. From the platform, from the Wikiprocessi platform, emerge a lot of data. On your left, you can see the first graph. The number of proceedings regarding disasters has grown since 2005, corresponded more or less to the first major catastrophes and the new sensitivities of being protected, from 10 cases to 108. The number of events does not increase in the same way. This means that there are more proceedings, more trials, more investigation today than yesterday. And why? The civil protection system has become, in Italy, over time, more efficient. It's not only good to rescuing, but also to predict and to manage disasters. And this means that people expect and demand more protection. Consequently, judges look for those who are responsible much more than in the past. And so this is the reason why we have more trials than events. It's also emerged that the proceedings arise especially after floods. If we consider that floods are becoming temporarily less frequent, but more violent and localized due to climate change, we get that in the future, we will observe many proceedings, many trials, unless we intervene with plans or with policies that seriously prevent the risk. The graph on your right shows that some Italian regions are more affected by proceedings due obviously to natural fragile territories, but also because they didn't work on risk prevention. Just an example, in Liguria region, here, the place where I live, and in Genoa, the municipality allowed houses to be built on cover rivers. We understand that in the 46% of cases, the trials lasts more than 6 years. Staying in a trials for a long time means loss of job opportunity for the person who is involved in the trials, but also a paralysis of institution. It should be clarified that trials often end with the prescription. That means even if the person was guilty, he cannot be convicted because too much time has passed since the crime. So the time of the process is a sort of condemnation, but without condemnation. In addition to wiki processing, we try to translate what we understand into concrete products. The dossier are the in-deep documents on specific events and trials. The notes to the judgment are documents on some particular sentences. And finally, the precipitates are the key message of the sentences. All these products have different recipients. As an example, the dossier is aimed at jurists. But the objective of this forensic investigation is to photograph the pathological phenomenon, the proceeding as a problem, the trials as a problem, and make it become a physiological fact. The disaster will repeat itself, and we know, and it will be managed to the best of our efforts. So it's a sort of a cultural change to address legal issues. It's called in Italy system error culture. From undergoing a fact, an event, an investigation, a process, to understand it, to predict and prevent others in the future. This culture encourage the legislation to be closer to reality, the experimentation with innovative solution to mitigate individual and also institutional responsibility and to improve the civil protection system from the inside. In this slide, I reported some of the innovative solution we do, but we have no time now to go in details. I just want to focus your attention on this other tool, the audit, because this is created to help forecaster to be better and to track their operational choices. What we learn from managing all of this data, in general, that investigations, proceedings, and trials, the importance of this judicial database, because this data is useful source of data, is a source of information. These data are not known but by civil protection operators, because the documents, the legal documents, are difficult to find, and also is difficult to understand because it's composed by technical legal words. This data must be known because tell us how the outside world sees and judge civil protection activities. This data must be studied by people who have obviously legal skills, but also a concrete experience in the field of civil protection, because in this way, these scientists are very involved in the civil protection system. It's fundamental, the cultural change, start from the error, understand the error, and improve the decision-making system. On a specific topic, we learn that civil protection planning must be participated by the population. This is a very important point. Only those who know the risk don't put themselves in danger. And in fact, CIMA tried to contribute to the creation of the 2021 participation law. Second, the traceability of the choices is fundamental element for reconstructing ex post what happened ex ante, and mitigating the risk of new disaster and responsibility. The mayor is the fulcrum of the municipal civil protection system, the local authorities, but he or she must be surrounded by other different competency and subjects. Deciding not to decide means deciding. The institution that deal with risk and disaster must work on prevention and prediction. Talking about responsibility to these individuals is useful to encourage them to do something. What civil protection has learned from our work? For sure, legal data as important as the natural, as the weather hydro data for forecasting. This legal data must be known by civil protection operators because they direct their activities. The discussion between operators and scholars and scientists is mutually functional. There is no judgment in this relationship, but exchange towards the objective of prevention. The data as a support the implementation of disaster risk mitigation measures, but also civil protection operator responsibility and law changes. And in the end, how is this sustainable? If you reach these 5 ingredients, you can. The first, you have to prone a closer relationship with the national civil protection authorities, because it gives you, also us, credibility to the operators and the possibility of influencing new laws, new regulation, new processes. Second, strong knowledge of the risk of a territory as a nation, but not only, also an area with the same risks. This is a precondition for understanding choices, activities, and obviously responsibilities. Third, multidisciplinary working group. In fact, jurists are not enough to create this monitoring platform. We have to call with the hydrologists, with the geologists, with IT operators, also with sociologists. Fourth, the financial line. Wikiprocessi is an easily replicable product with a few economic resources, but the to power the platform, definitive human resources are needed over several years. And finally, a strong propensity for comparison and a strong aptitude for experimentation, new solutions. I really thank you for your attention and to invite me in this beautiful meeting. Thank you.
Francesca, thank you so much for your presentation. We appreciate that you're coming to us late at night, and we appreciate your time and the information you've given us. Ideally, for disaster preparedness, it would be great if we could have all of our policies and laws in a way that we don't need to have disputes and courts involved, but obviously we know that that's not the reality of this world. Now, I have great pleasure in introducing Jonatan Lassa from GNS Science New Zealand, who's going to talk on graph theory and disaster management laws, results from Indonesia and Australia. Welcome, Jonatan.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Jonatan Lassa. I would like to show some of my work from PhD time and then postdoc time, but I've been sleeping on this for 14 years after the first draft. Just want to check with you, how many of you are aware about graph theory or network theory? Social network analysis? No? All right, so they're kind of the same thing. Right, so the motivation behind this was when I look at when preparing for my PhD submission and thinking about the title, I look at the data in 2010, why some of the national laws or acts in different sector, if you want to call like that, but still related to risk reduction, they have kind of different pathways of adoption. So for example, in order to manage your risk, you need spatial planning. And in order to regulate your spatial planning, you need this kind of law. So spatial planning law and disaster management law came almost at the same year, in 2007, just by a month or two different in terms of time. And there was a building law. I was trained as a civil engineer, so I was kind of naturally going into building law to see how disaster legislators or legislators in general think about disasters. So for building law, it took almost 8 years just to get this very low adoption at the local level. So that's the reason why I titled my PhD as kind of polycentric governance, because it seems like you cannot simply regulate risks from traditional emergency management point of view. You need to, and I borrowed the theory from Olin Ostrom, who happened to be a Nobel Prize for economics studies in 2010. So I used graph theory because my professor said that, okay, you are doing PhD in engineering, but somehow you ended up doing social science. Can you make it like numbers so we can understand? So I don't know how to do that. I went to train as a social scientist, but then I feel like every time you put in the table, your professor cannot get it. So you have to play around with that. So I use one of the theory is network theory. So basically it's links and dots, you have been doing that. If you send an email to somebody, you have been doing this kind of ages, right? You send an email from you to your friends, it's a social connection. You have been practicing this kind of graph theory, but you didn't put it in mind. So you're not too far from there. I think everybody can do these kind of things. And nowadays we have plenty of softwares to do this automatically. So there are terminologies like edges or links, and sometimes we call it dots or nodes or vertices, whatever. But basically, if you are a person here, you have at least 4 connections. In the network terminology, you have 4 degrees of connections. Easy, right? And then if you are at the number, you are the D person, you have 1 connections. you are vulnerable because you are probably, when B dies, you are left alone. Sad story. Right, so, the interesting point about this is if you put everybody's network in this big room and then thinking about society in general, you will have more complex network. And that's why some of the theories will be very useful to understand how things are connected. And I took this to legal. And the dot that I treat is, every dot is a law or an act. So I'll show you. So it's very easy. Usually disaster scholars do not play around with this, and network scholars don't think disaster is kind of this stuff. The same thing like disaster law. I look at the DRR project from ADPC Bangkok at the time. They listed almost all the disaster risk reduction project in the Pacific and Asia. And I think nobody make use of the data because they see like, this is just like a, what you call a spreadsheet that could be meaningless. But to network scientists, they feel like, okay, there is something there. So I work with my student to, because he has more time. So his thesis we published in DR Journal in 2019. Basically, I collected all the data for him, and then he was brave enough to learn about this. So we wanted to see how things are connected, and so on. I think the time is only 10 minutes, right? So I'll just skip some of them. I just wanted to impress you about this. Yeah, so I've been using this for my PhD, looking at social network connection behind the drafting of the Indonesian disaster management law. Somehow I didn't publish this. So it ended up just a few fraction in my PhD thesis. But at the time I was able to look at the big players behind the draftings like UNDP, funded different people to just have different, to have deliberation. So people could have more than just one ideas, and Oxfam and so on, including the governments have their own think tanks. It was a beautiful contestation in the disaster law-making process. And I published this only in my PhD thesis, unfortunately. Yeah, so I've been using this also for the Indian Ocean tsunamis, just in case you're interested. But just wanted to show you that network theory can play big roles in understanding the details of the interactions between humans, discourse, and ideas, and so on. So this is the project that I show you. This is the title, Connecting Actors in the Pacific. I'll skip this because this is just an introduction. So now I want to apply this kind of methods into disaster laws. So I kind of creating some kind of explorative questions. Yeah, 3 minutes, right? Yeah, so how constitutions, laws, and regulation are connected or disconnected, and how can they be visualized? And I also complement the method using discourse analysis or discourse institutionalism, if you're interested about this, because I look at discourse as institutions. Discourse is not just like empty ideas out there, because the way you behave, like yesterday I tested, not really tested, but I questioned Raymond about early warning, early response, and it tended to argue that probably every terminology has its own IDs. For me, it's all construct, social construct. You can actually give meaning to any terminology that you want, but this doesn't work like that. So once you construct something, it becomes an ID and it defends itself. So it's regulate behavior as well. So that's how I treat it. So this is how I interpreted the act. So this is, for example, coming from Queensland. I've been looking at Australia since I arrived there in 2016. Usually nowadays, it's pretty easy to code because you can use machine learning. And that's what I'm planning to do with my colleagues at GNS, because we have a few computer geeks and scientists there. So we wanted to computize this, and we can do nationwide kind of law legal database. So you can see that in order to manage your risk, you They mentioned about the police law. Not so sure whether there is police law here, but yeah, there are plenty of that in different type of laws and health-related Public Health Act and so on. So disaster management laws cannot operate on its own. It should connect to different type of rules of the game. You operate not in vacuum, right? You operate in a context. So this is how I come up with the Australian model. And this clearly shows there is no central model because it's kind of federal model. It's, yeah, I think I will probably take more 2 minutes. And this is, for example, the Tasmanian law. The Police Service Act is included, and as I think we saw yesterday, police is always a very important part of the basic emergency operation function. This is how you put them together in a more complicated way. And this is for Indonesia. I do the same. So the number, when you click the red, it will show how it connects to different type of laws. Okay, it's pretty messy. It's 100 local disaster management laws and they have different qualities from time to time. So this is like one of the least, less in terms of quality, it's very low because it doesn't think about risk management in a kind of multi-disciplinary settings, multi-regulatory overlaps and so on. They just think about the money and also they just think about the national disaster management law. There are 2 different provinces that I think they are more complex in their views about risk and risk reduction. I think I'm running out of time, so I'm going directly to my, probably this is final, not yet final. Okay, so this is based on the prediction coming out from the data from graph theory. Forget about the scatter plot there. It's there, but it's pretty hard to explain. So the percentage, how likely local government think about spatial planning as a law that you need to comply when you draft disaster management law? It's 9%. How likely environment or climate change will be considered in disaster management law? It's less than 1%. So in all the talks about DRR, CCA kind of integration, it doesn't exist in the mind of the legislators and the experts that drafted the legislation at the local level. So we keep blaming, we keep changing that things are probably not working, but we have to look at the details because the details is always in the details, right? So, and plenty of that, I think I will just skip to the final, sorry for the time. So insights in rule-based arrangement and law-dependent interaction, I think we could use network theory or graph theory to predict coordination, at least at the legal level. Because institutions I took it from institutional studies, it's kind of rule of the games too. So it's not legal, but it's kind of having the power to shape people's behavior in terms of coordinating with others to reduce risk. And what happens when law and acts are not connected? So we have seen this. So it depends really on the agency of the people who are out there. So if you wanted to explain why disaster law was kind of more, it was adapted at faster pace compared to different laws, is because international players are on it. So it leads to my thesis about polycentric governance again, because you cannot go down to this pathway because there are different pathways, but all those pathways are kind of incentive dependent. So it's kind of projects. So once you have finished international projects, local government cannot pick it up because it's not guaranteed by the law. The law doesn't allow them to think about much. So I come from NT, I live in NT in Australia for the last 8 years. And the way NT think about disaster management law is very simple. They just think about three to 6 different type of departments that they can link up. But you go down to Queensland or probably ACT in Canberra, they think about, oh, probably we need to mention about 50 other institutions, and every institutions are dependent on their own kind of rule of law. I mean, law, X. So predicting DRR, so the hypothesis is the quality of a local disaster management bill or act can be defined by the number of the connections. But we have to look at the details. And the probability of local legislators or governments linking DRR with spatial planning policy is less. No wonder why you always have this kind of problem. And the probability of local legislators linking DRR with climate change related is less than 1%. And I cannot refute the data. Of course, based on this, you have to think about different pathways in order to bring the, so there is something there for law studies to continue. Thank you so much.
Our next presenter is Carolynne Hultquist from the University of Canterbury, and she's talking about incorporating local data to ensure that no one is left behind. Thank you.
Thank you. You all have had a very good chance to look at my first slide, so I won't stay on it long. But kia ora. As my people, the Choctaw, would say, halito, tene koto katoa. My name's Carolynne Hultquist. I work here at UC. I work related to geospatial data science, and hopefully you'll see some of the richness of engaging in disasters with geospatial technologies and communities. And I hope to really inspire you to think about ways that you could possibly use this in your own work. I did put a QR code here and a link, which you will see again. I've taught students in this room of 100, and I see that a lot of times it helps to engage them with something to do. So if you want to fill out this survey, you could share about some of the community engagement that you do or some of the projects that you're aware of. And also it offers a way to connect if you're interested in collaborating. So this is a bit about who I am in a word cloud. So I really work at this intersection of disasters and community data and bringing together communities talking about vulnerability and disaster monitoring and hazards. And I've worked across a number of different hazards. I'm really excited to be here in Aotearoa and have the opportunity to engage with the Pacific region. I've been here about 2 years and really looking for more collaborations in this space. Doing things with earthquakes now. I have a long thread on flooding, which you're going to see some of. But really, I think there's things that can be taken from this and applied across all different types of hazards and fields. So this is just an example of some of the scientific work that I do regarding integrating data from people. So observations of where people are seeing flooding and submitting images, incorporating that with observational networks, models, and remote sensing so that we can bring these data sets together and look at validation, consider uncertainty, look at temporal frames of when we have data from certain sources and not others, and really create an integrated platform in which we can incorporate these different data sets. So a lot of times during disasters and with these events, we often have a lot of different data coming at us pretty quickly, and it can be really difficult to sort through. I guess that's one of my experiences. It seems like a lot of nodding heads. And a lot of times these products, these data sets need to be tailored in certain ways for us to actually use them to make decisions. And so I think it's really important to think about some of those things beforehand and have a system set up so we can actually bring that data together in meaningful ways, and really also consider this additional portion of it, which is bringing in data from underrepresented groups and ensuring that we're actually capturing those populations. And there's things that we can do intentionally with engaging with communities to ensure that we actually are incorporating those populations and making sure no one's left behind. So some of the work that I do is not just about working with this raw data we often think of collecting data from people, but also about bringing in insights and working with communities, incorporating local knowledge, and really making progress in the goals. It's, in my mind, part of our responsibility, not just to monitor, but also to try to make progress, try to go towards action. So I'm going to give you an example. I actually threw this in last night because I was thinking about the anticipatory action session from yesterday. And so thinking about ways that we can actually bring in community, let's say during or part of some of our pre-existing systems. So this is an example of the flash flooding project that I worked with in Ecuador with Humberto Vergara, who's at NOAA in the US. And there's different components of it. So you have the flood product kind of portion of the model, and this can be involved with using evaluations from experts, from humanitarian actors locally. You have this portion, which is bringing in historical records, which can also have contributions from communities, from citizens about where these hazards have occurred in the past. And then you can also bring in things about vulnerability and about populations that might be underserved in these areas, and bringing the community in to help inform on where these areas might be. There's some really great examples I'll talk about in Africa related to slums and incorporating that population soon. And then finally, you end up with your impact sort of layers, right? And I think it's super valuable to bring community in at this stage too, where you engage on where the hazard is being predicted. Maybe there's something wrong with the model. Maybe the community is like, no, it doesn't go there. It actually, the river flows here. You didn't incorporate the drain in your model, or so on and so forth. It's really valuable, I think, to think about who's potentially left out, places that are populated, which may not be in your population data. Like there's whole villages that have been found because people didn't know they were there. And so it's really, I think, an important part is to talk with community at that stage and think about what actions could be taken. So this is part of this growing movement generally, globally, that I'm going to talk about. Many of you are probably familiar with the term citizen science, probably, yeah, which is generally the participation of people gathering scientific data or contributing data. But there's a big movement, or I'd say a revolution, in citizen data towards people generating the data for the people. And we often call this citizen-generated data. And so the idea is that there's more of a stewardship of it. It's community engagement, collaborative. We are intentionally targeting specific data gaps, and we work with the community to help to meet those needs and also involve them in part of the decision-making and understanding what the outcome is from that. So it's not just a passive contribution, but an active participation within that and in that engagement. So I'm going to give you some examples from Christchurch, some local examples of kind of what this spectrum looks like. So within the literature for citizen science and community data, we often frame it as kind of more passive end as these contributory sort of projects. And we're moving towards a lot of these more collegial projects. And so we have this kind of definition of this extreme sort of collection of analysis and engagement with communities. So instead of just say submitting an image, which we might have like with this CoastSnap project, we have more engaged projects with cultural mapping and community-driven sort of projects of how the landscape might look like, trying to reimagine cities or directly being involved in those connections. So these are just some examples. So I'm part of this group for CoData, or the Committee on Data. We work with global policy around how data is used and the ethics around it. And the group that I co-chair is really focused on demonstrating the use of community data and encouraging the inclusion of that in official monitoring from the SDGs, disaster-related monitoring, and other sort of policies. We all kind of have our own angle. Some people are more in the biodiversity space, and people have their own sort of angle that they're directed in. But this is just some of my collaborators from this group globally, and we want to start more of a regional sort of group moving too, about some of the Pacific and Asian groups that are involved in this community space. This is Peter Elias. He's my co-chair, and he are involved with Idea Maps, which works with slum mapping in deprived areas. Anyways, I won't go into the details as I don't have time, but all of us are really working together to try to push this forward. We've worked a lot kind of in the citizen science space around stewardship and data over the last couple of years, and really towards trying to make the SDGs more accessible for communities. So creating frameworks about how communities can actually contribute directly to specific indicators and connecting them with partners in country. So this is all part of this overarching work to involve communities. So their current aims are really trying to connect between these groups. So we have kind of these, top-down sort of groups, and we want to connect communities with these groups to create partnerships to help encourage communities to be engaged on these problems and issues that are really important for those regions. We're working really closely with the UNSD to help incorporate this as a framework. I was at the meeting for Copenhagen last year, so we have a Copenhagen framework now that we're refining to help to specify specific data practices about how the data is used, how we manage the data, the ethics surrounding it, and really encouraging communities to engage. So, final slide. This is just a call for interest in collaboration. So if you have an example, you're welcome to put it on the survey that I gave you. And also, if you're interested potentially in contributing to a report, we're going to be writing one now. I would invite you to our global meeting, but it's held tonight at midnight. So we're going to have our own regional meeting, which will be during daylight hours on this side of the world. So yeah, really excited to collaborate regionally. Feel free to reach out by email too. And I will leave it there. Thank you.
Last, but of course not least, we have Smrithi Talwar from the GNS Science New Zealand, and she's talking on CBDRM law and practice in Vietnam, science law practice interfaces in a Vietnamese dam safety project. Thank you.
Kia ora koto, ko Smrithi Talwar toko ingoa. Hello everyone, I'm Smrithi Talwar. I'm an environmental lawyer and a social scientist working at GNS Science within part of a larger social science team. What I'm going to be doing today is to be presenting an overview of really a journey that we've been on, because it's a project which has had multiple heads to it, but which has been on for over a decade, 12, 13 years. This is a team that I really want to acknowledge in this work. This is actually just a small subset of the people who have been involved with this work for a very long period of time. I do want to say as well that, my own background as a lawyer and a social scientist are always the two hats that I wear when I make these presentations. And I think that might become more obvious as we go on in this presentation. So in terms of where I want to start, it's this event that took place right at the very start when we started this work in 2012. And it's not an unusual event. Middle of the day, people are sitting down to lunch, and they had been observing that the water levels in this dam that's next to where they live had been going up and down all week because of heavy rains. But that moment when that dam actually finally broke was a shock. And this is the thing. I mean, part of our what we strive to do is to sort of embed that preparedness, embed that response in a way that is actually culturally resonative for local people. Because in a situation such as this, you don't have often too much time to respond. Luckily, in this case, people, even though they didn't have an existing protocol, they were able to come together in a way that actually resulted in no one dying, although there was injuries. But there were very significant economic consequences that lasted for several years. So for those who maybe aren't aware of Vietnam, it's this long, skinny country at the very edge of the Asian continent. And because of its long coastline, it's very exposed to cyclones, tsunamis, storm events. But it's also got a whole range of rivers that flow through it on the way to the sea. And these rivers are dammed more often than not, either for electricity or for agriculture. And the reality is that a lot of these dams are quite old now, and they themselves are a source of disaster risk. So the government knows this. In Vietnam, there's a whole network of laws, policies that seek to engage with natural disasters and risk preparedness, risk management. In this presentation, I'm only going to focus on this 2013 law because it's the enabling legislation for something that we call CBDRM, the Community-Based Disaster Risk Management. And just to provide a little bit more context for why a country that has such a centralized government, I mean, for those who are familiar with Vietnam, it's quite a controlling government, shall we say. And for them to sort of engage with CBDRM, you have to sort of ask why. Part of the reason is because there was a need. A lot, as I said, there's thousands and thousands of dams, several 100,000 communities that are impacted by disaster risk as a result of these dam failures. And there's very poor existing protocols around their management. And yet, it's really not viable to actually look at infrastructure upgrades, for example, for each dam. Partly it's because it's too expensive, but also because, over the years, we've understood that the best case is not to look at each dam in isolation or each community in isolation, but rather to look at it almost like in a river basin approach, to look at the system of dams that are situated along a river, to look at the connections between upstream and downstream communities. And the other sort of, I guess, really important reason why the government is pushing the CBDRM in Vietnam is because there's a local cultural context, which we saw in that previous example I provided, which really does look at, people rally around, people come together. If there's this community cultural response that is already sort of existing there as a foundation on which to build from. So this isn't sort of just a completely imposed kind of policy. But the policy itself, as I said, super quickly, it was something that ran from 2009 to 2020. That was just the first phase. Just in terms of the lessons that were learned, it was that it's really expensive to sort of have a very individualized focus on each of those communities, on each of those dams. That maybe isn't the best way forward. So the second phase, which is a phase that we're in at the moment, which runs till 2030, is a phase that is going to focus much more on developing those general principles that then communities and local groups can take forward to coming up with their own sort of, I guess, more locally embedded responses to disasters. Again, the role of the government is to sort of maybe facilitate those networks, either between those communities or between the communities and local government officials, as well as, the people who own those dams, who operate those dams. But now coming to the work that we're doing at GNS. So when we started in 2012, it was very, very strongly science-focused. I mean, I think the subtext to all of this is that we were really interested in establishing those relationships with the government. So we actually spent most of the time in Hanoi, in the capital, working with the government, bringing from our side, I guess, our knowledge of global best practices, coming up with the science behind what is involved with sort of, ensuring dam safety, structural issues, engineering issues. And what that resulted in, obviously, were these guidelines, which have now been adopted by the government as their preferred approach nationally to dam safety. But perhaps more importantly, it established the foundation for the relationship with the government and that relationship of trust, more importantly. Subsequently, I would say this is now, we're looking at 2016, 2017. We took those guidelines and have come up with this tool that we call a dam rapid assessment and prioritization tool, which is something that can be used more locally. So now we're working in this phase with regional government officials, maybe at the mid-level, Still not everybody in the community. I would say these are perhaps the experts. We're still working with the civil engineers and government, for example. But still, you can see the progress in our relationships in the government and in the community. Last year, finally, after 11, 12 years of engagement in Vietnam, we finally started working with the local community. And the images to your left are us just wandering around a landscape with local government representatives. So this is still not everybody in the local community. These are still, it's like the women that you see in the images are the elected representatives of the women's groups. The young people that you see are the elected representatives of the youth associations. This is still not everybody. But what we then do, as I said, is we walk around with these local representatives, have a sort of a bit of a conversation around what the science is suggesting needs to be done. The local officials talk about the law, the policies, what that enables. And what the local people then do is to work on these cadastral maps that are very detailed for their local situation. And they identify on these maps the infrastructure that is most important to them to protect, and the communities or the people within their communities who they're most worried about. Once they do that, we then have a bit of a conversation about, so what are existing ways in which you might respond in case there's a disaster. Obviously, we then actually look at what the science suggests needs to be done. The science will say that if the dam bursts, this is the way the water is likely to flow, etc. There's then a conversation about sort of what might be possible for the government to do to support those communities to improve existing ways to respond to this situation. So, I mean, I'm not going to play this partly because it's in Vietnamese, but essentially, we're really pleased with how this is going. I mean, I started my career as, I'm a lawyer, and I've very much focused on the text of the law, what needs to be done to sort of improve the language. And I guess over the years, what I've really realized is that, the law is what is actually understood and taken up and implemented. And that can look super different across different people. It can be completely different across institutions. And there's kind of no shortcuts. You have to sort of take your time to establish those relationships. But then there can be progress at the end of the day. Thank you so much.
We've now got time for questions. Our morning tea is at 11 o'clock, so we have half an hour for questions. And please ask away of all of our presenters.
I'm Sazin Nupani. I'm a PhD student here at Massey University in Wellington. I would like to know a bit detail about how CBDRM process in GNS initiated in a country like Vietnam, where as you said, it's very top-down governance system. How did you see the community engagement in taking all of these developed protocols or guidelines and translating them to the people who would need to use it eventually?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as I said, the actual engagement that we've started with local communities has only started last year, but the foundations for that have been 10 years, 12 years before that. So in terms of the uptake, I suppose it's still to be revealed. I mean, I've had so much learning from our side, and this is the thing that maybe connects back to sort of, I guess, previous presentations, for example, what Carolynne was talking about. We're really engaged now with co-creation of knowledge. Obviously, the scientists we work with, the GNS science, have a lot of technical understanding of sort of structural factors behind why dams might be more or less vulnerable due to disaster risks, due to climate change. But the reality is that, that risk is interfaced by management protocols. That's human beings, the way in which human beings manage that infrastructure. And risk there is partly based on their knowledge, but also risk perception. I mean, do they actually think it's a danger? Is this an important thing? Do they have other priorities? There's a whole range of issues that influence how and why risk is perceived differently across communities, how they address it. We're still in the learning process, to be honest. It's been a year of a 12-year journey. So yeah.
Hi, good morning. My name is Leonard Chen. I'm from Fiji, one of the private sector representatives. Question to Smrithi. I liked your presentation on the approach that has been taken for Vietnam. We had similar challenges when we set up some resilience councils within Fiji and tried to work with the community, or I would probably say from the keynote speaker, Marco, when he mentioned hands on deck, whole of society. I mean, it has been a challenging journey for us. I just wanted to probably get your feedback, some of the challenges you face to get these various levels of stakeholders together, and how you continue to strive to see that whole of society approach is there, and how we can, as a Pacific nation, learn from that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks again. It's a bit of an intrinsic contradiction, you would think, because CBDRM suggests a bottom-up approach. And yet, honestly, in a context like Vietnam, it does help when you have that signaling come from the top down that this is all right. And in a sense, you won't get any buy-in. You know, people will be so paralyzed and so reluctant to engage with any kind of discussion without that top-down direction. And this is a slightly odd thing to say, but honestly, there are sort of, I guess, efficiencies to a slightly more controlled, dictatorial kind of political system, because when that messaging comes, it actually sort of travels down through society in a way that, honestly, in democracies, that messaging gets much more diffused, it's contested, it's so there are efficiencies in these systems. But having said all of that, it has to be locally embedded, and it has to make sense for people who are actually at the front end of those disasters. And that looks really different. I mean, it's actually a massively heterogeneous country. It's long and extremely a narrow country, but the reality, sort of culturally, physically, geographically, is so different from the south to the north, that if you're not actually engaged with what does this mean, how does this law translate to this context versus the other, so you can't escape that. There has to be that translation to local realities. It's a long process. It's been a journey. Yeah.
We were posed by different stakeholders. Question of what is it need for me in terms of getting a project completion.
Yeah.
So we pose the question is, what is it for you is you become the project.
Yeah.
You take ownership.
Yeah. 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 No, and this maybe sort of also links with what Jonathan was saying, about Eleanor Ostrom's work, which is to do with sort of, whether for community resources, you need to sort of think about stakes, what are the vested interests that exist in managing a particular resource a particular way, and what might be ways you can shift behaviors to getting that more embedded. But in our case, it's slightly different. These are life and death situations, and these are also sort of realities that people see happening more frequently. So that's one thing. And the second thing is there is this local tradition. People. It is a society where people do listen to authority. There is that cultural component to it, but there is a reality where if there is an earthquake, if there is a flooding event, people do rally around. It's not just every person for themselves, not at all. In Vietnam, people will stop and say, "Oh my gosh, what about my grandmother? What about my disabled nephew?" 100%, and that's almost irreplaceable. And I don't know what you would do without that. Yeah.
Kia ora. I'm John Hopkins from the University of Canterbury. Thanks. I thought they were all great presentations. I just wanted, and I had lots of questions, but I have one question for Francesca. So I was really fascinated in your project. I think that's a really interesting, I've never seen anything like that done before, so it's fascinating. I just have a couple of questions. When you're looking at cases, is it across all branches of law? And in which case, where do you find most of your data is from? And then the second question was, how accepting do you find this? Because it's quite an unusual thing to do in the emergency management community. And I wondered how accepting have you to the sort of work that you've discovered, the data that you've found, how accepting are they to incorporating it in their practice? Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. We use data we search data on the web and on the official websites of sentences. So as we consider as journalistic investigation, we use the web, the news, and also an artificial intelligent algorithm to capture all of the information in the web because we wanted to monitor not only trials of Italy, but also European and if it's possible, international processes and trials. As we consider the crime news, we reach this information from the database, the government database, but is closed to the community, is open only to advocates and judges and a few persons. When we talk about the technical documentation of trials, and this is the most the hardest work, because it's difficult to reach the advocates and to reach the judge to have these materials, but we try to do through it because it's important to have just an example, the consultancies. And about the sentences, some of them are public, but not all. And so we reach the sentences, call the judge, call the court, and email them. And so it's another work, but we try to do that.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marlon Era. I'm from the Philippines. I'm from Manila. See you next year. Oh, I enjoyed listening to all the presenters. I would like to start by saying that community engagement is key because this is what we're supposed to do. And I realized that community engagement is a symbiotic relationship. So the community should benefit also, while the outside people, the researchers, will also benefit. I'll start with Carolynne. Thank you for your citizenship, we call that citizens science. I'm happy that there is such effort to engage people and make them part of the process in knowing more about their own community. And I'm happy too that Jonatan mentioned that the network theory, the social network analysis could be used for social interactions. And of course, Smrithi provided a specific case of community engagement. My question for the three of you is, how can we ensure a genuine community engagement in the things that you do? Is my question clear?
You said, how can we
ensure genuine, the real community engagement? Because community engagement is a beautiful word, and it can be, thank you.
I guess I'll start. I feel like that's something that can be set up in the framing of that type of engagement, right? And I think that is one of the issues sometimes. We tend to put a label on things and go, oh, it's, community engagement or it's citizen science. So that means that it has all of these huge amount of benefits that have ever been recorded for anyone engaging with community. But I think we need to be really realistic about the way in which we're engaging and the sort of involvement that we're having with the community, and actually that kind of, as you're mentioning, the connection that's giving back to the community and what exactly it is that they're contributing to. It's not just like, okay, you've contacted a community, now you're good, right? And I think that sort of intentional with purpose things can be set up It just needs to be very clearly established, right? Of, okay, so what is it that they're bringing in? What sort of planning are we involving them in? What type of decision making? What process? It's more directed than kind of a one for all sort of smorgasbord of engagement where you talk with people, but what you get from that isn't clear. And so I guess I would just encourage it as like a thing to think about when you're framing those things, that there are many different options about how to engage with communities. And it's important to kind of set that up intentionally. And going back to some of the other questions too, of like meeting in the middle, I feel like there's a real need to bridge. So it's not that we just say communities should just kind of deal with it. They should come up with stuff themselves. And it's not that we should necessarily just dictate everything. I think there can be certain times in a disaster where you do have to dictate more. But really the merger, the meeting, I think, of both is where you find the most richness, where you're coming together for common purpose, and particularly on issues that the communities are really interested in and want to be engaged in. I think you'll find the most participation on things that people see as really real and pressing issues for their region, for their area.
Should I? So, I mean, I would always start with, I guess, the obvious question, which is, who is the local community? And I think often when you're in a lot of these rural contexts, but also in these kinds of developing countries, there's a huge percentage of the local population who are either migrating out frequently for labor. Young men tend to sort of go out and look for jobs in cities, etc., and then come back, and the other way. And I think part of the huge challenge that we have in our projects is that, you're trying to design, but you're not sure, who it's this fictitious, stable community that has always lived there, whereas actually there's a lot of fluidity in it. And trying to capture the perspectives of those people who are frequently on the margins, who aren't part of the conversation, it requires a very deliberate effort. You're sort of saying to people, normally particularly in a context like Vietnam, you're normally going with the village chief, you're normally going with the elected representatives, but then you're saying, could I please speak with the young people? Could I please speak with the people from this ethnic minority? Which is, I mean, in a way it's easier because you're the outsider, you're the foreigner, but it's also slightly, you've got to be aware of sort of the fact that there might be repercussions on them. The minute you leave, there's a whole political context to knowledge exchange in that context. But particularly with the migration, it's a massive issue across the developing world now, particularly between rural and urban areas. It impacts gender issues very significantly, but also I would say ethnic minority issues massively as well. I'll leave it there. Hugely complex issue here.
Thank you. I think that's one of the most difficult questions. Engaging for what? I've been working with NGOs before coming to the science kind of world in the last 10 years. And the more I listen to scientists promoting the transdisciplinary approach, sometimes I feel like, okay, they are ending up like an NGO that we have been doing participatory approach 30 years ago. So it's like you are moving to the future, but you are arriving in 1990s. Sorry for that. But my approach is no regret. Engaging with community, no regret. I think there is always cynical approach that, okay, you are a researcher, you get paid for what you do, and you exploit us to get information. Sayonara after the engagement. I think it's fine. I think it's better than the alternatives, because through engagement, you trigger some kind of conversations that opens up some kind of reflections, and the outcomes might not be bad at all. So I think no regret with that kind of approach. If you have money and funding for that and passing the ethics committee that you engage with committee, because it slows down your process in the university, I think that's fine. That's kind of my response. Thank you.
Thank you very much. an intergovernmental regional organization that works in the Pacific Island countries, SPC, the Pacific Community. SPC is recognized as one of the leading scientific regional organizations in the Pacific Island countries. And this is a constant challenge that we always face. We collect a lot of data. We do a lot of scientific and technical work. The main challenge that we are faced with is translating those technical and scientific information into practice and in a manner that's easily relatable and understood by policymakers. And I'm really happy to hear the presentations, and particularly the panelists that focus on the collection of data. And I would like to pose a question in regards to your advice on how you think what you're doing now can be translated into a manner that would be easily understood by policymakers, or how does your work translate into something that can be easily understood? So I'll take, for example, what we have been doing in SPC, where we collect a lot of LiDAR data and also coastal inundation data. And most recently, we've translated those into 3-dimensional models for the Republic of the Marshall Islands and Tuvalu, 2 countries, 2 low-lying atoll countries, where people and their policymakers would look at the 3D models and can see their houses, can see where their freshwater source is, and with what the science is telling us with the coastal inundation and sea level rise projections and the different scenarios under the IPCC, you can see houses turning red. That means your house will be covered with salt water in the next 5 or 10 years' time. That's the kind of thing that we are now moving into and trying to translate science into something that when people look at it and they see their house is at risk, when the politicians see that, okay, our only freshwater source in the Marshall Islands will be inundated by sea level within the next 15 years or next 20 years. That actually prompts a different kind of thinking from the business as usual. And so I just wanted to understand how does your work translate into that kind of maybe an output that would be relatable to normal people, ordinary people that don't have any science background. Thank you.
I think this is a really critical question, and I think it also brings into play things around community response to this sort of hazard information and some of the psychological side too, right, and the implications of how it's taken and the way that we express risk and uncertainty or other factors, I think is really crucial. So it's understood in a concrete way and also potentially has actions tied to it or plans or ways that we can lead from it. So we're not just leaving them with this is very bad, but let's think about some of the solutions. And I understand that climate change and these sort of inundations and things like that are really complex topics. And it can be really hard to translate between this scientific lingo and the direct community impacts. I think it's a challenge like for society at large of linking those together. I don't think there's necessarily an easy one-way solution to that. There are many ways that people are trying to address it, some of which using different visual technologies, using virtual reality, using different 2D mapping representations or printing it out so the community can really see it and engage with it in a mapping form. There's ways we can do it in virtual space or web-based maps. There's so many different ways to kind of go about how we present that as a layer. But I agree, it needs to be explained, and that's what often can be missing. So there's a big push towards, I don't know if any of you have heard of or used story maps. There's a big push towards story maps, which is an Esri mapping product, which basically allows you to embed maps alongside narrative and information and story and videos or images and other things. And I've personally found that is really useful with engaging with communities. around not just the raw data, but having the context. Okay, what does this mean for the globe, for the region as a challenge? Having videos of people describing it, could be scientists, could be community members. I find that really useful and really powerful for communities to kind of not just get the map, but also to kind of understand the context, and you can guide people through that a lot more directly, I think, than other sort of media. And it allows people to evaluate it, zoom in, analyze things themselves, and really look at the data. And I think that's really important to allow people to have access to the data directly, but in a way that's meaningful to them.
And if I could just add to that quickly as well. I mean, I think one of the almost like the critical challenge as well in this whole science, law, local community practice conversations is that communication of uncertainty, because if the science advice was this will happen or this won't happen, that's pretty clear and everyone would know what to do. But the reality is the science advice is often couched in probabilities. And that becomes extremely challenging both for policymakers as well as for local communities to understand what is 75% mean. I mean, is that good? Is that bad? What about 5%? And that all gets interfaced with a cultural interface. What is your own threshold personally? I mean, you might be a risk taker for you might be sort of and we know, for example, there are gender differences there. Men tend to be much more risk taking. Women tend to be risk averse. I mean, there's lots of different ways this can fracture down. I would just say that, I think the IPCC has done fantastic work with communicating a language that is, I guess, cuts through, and it's a consistent way of framing uncertainty. And I would also sort of say, just speaking for our own project in Vietnam, that was actually part of the focus that we were looking at. What could be practically useful? That draft tool that I mentioned is a risk evaluation tool, which looks different the way it's when it's applied in context A versus context B, because there's a myriad of factors that get influenced in that assessment. But it's also sort of it's a practical way of taking guidelines, which are very abstract, very hypothetical, and making it concrete for your situation. It's a key challenge, I would say. Yeah.
I've just got time for 2 more questions. I've got one person who's online, who's been waiting very patiently, who's Rita. So if she could ask a question, and then I'd like to finish with a question from Marco. So anyone else that has questions, I'm sorry if we haven't got round to you, but please seek out our wonderful presenters at morning tea. But Rita, please ask your question.
Hi, I'm Rita. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Canterbury in law, and I was very interested in the presentation by Ms. Talwar. Thank you for sharing the community level engagement. My question was, could you share what measures was used to get the community in Vietnam to contribute to your initiative, the project?
Sorry, was the question how we got them to participate? Was that the question?
Sorry, I repeat that. So what measures was used to get the community in Vietnam to contribute to your initiative, the project?
So, I mean, I would say just years and years and years of conversations. It wasn't like a single measure. And it was also sort of the fact that I think there was a comfort factor that the local, they wouldn't even have been allowed to maybe even speak with us if they hadn't perhaps received the green light from the local military authorities, the local, there's a whole, it's quite a complex political structure, which often their local people are very disincentivized to ignore. In fact, you are so significantly penalized if you ignore it that it's easier just to sort of just comply. Honestly, in terms of sort of getting that participation, as I said, it was 10 years of effort, 10 years of not just conversations, but proving, in a sense, value. 10 years of sort of proving value at the center in Hanoi, but also at the regional level. So it wasn't a single measure. I would say just banging away at it, banging away, persisting. Yeah. I'm not sure if maybe I didn't quite understand. Did I understand the question correctly? Were you looking for one measure? Was that what your question was?
Just initiatives that was used to get community to participate more, contribute more, and give in their understanding and knowledge.
Yeah,
That's what I was looking at.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, starting from about 2016, 2017, we were much more engaged in the regional and local levels, but working with local officials. And that sort of enabled introductions. Initially, it was just conversations with the head person and not leading. These weren't transactional. This wasn't, it was more just having cups of tea. It was literally just meals. And then that has led to this current phase which has just started last year. Yeah, sorry, I know we're running short of time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Last one, Marco.
This is a question for you, Francesca. Thank you for the presentation. Two aspects. Your presentation seems to suggest that it's important to work with the judiciary. Normally, when we speak all state institutions, we consider the executive, to a certain extent, the parliaments, but in reality, what you're also bringing to the table is the role of the judiciary. Here, the question would be, are there any training programs for judges and lawyers? And there would be, a merit into exploring that. And the second question is, there seemed to be a discrepancy, if I recall correctly from your slides, between the number of cases versus the number of disasters. And that discrepancy seems to point to an increased awareness. Are those data usable also from other stakeholders like scientists that can help in increasing this cultural prevention? Because the cultural element that has also come in the presentation from the colleagues here in the room. So thank you.
Really, thank you for your questions. For the first one, we organize the training for judges and for researchers and also for students, not for jurists, but also for engineers. We have a strange relationship with 4 universities in Italy, university in Milan that called Cattolica, University of Genoa, University of Trento, and another university in Milan, but a special school for panelists. We organize these courses, this formation, because we think that is important to catch a judge before they judge the civil protection operators, to create a contest to force the judge to think if there are in the same position of the civil protection operators, so not with the bias of the ex post bias, but we force them to put them in ex ante situation. How I face that situation, in which way? In the same way of the civil protection operators that I should judge. And so this is a very important part of our work, to go to the university, but also to go to the courts, to go to the judge and learn the civil protection system activities and talk about that. For the second questions was about the numbers of cases and the numbers of trials, the numbers of events. I said that there are no correspondence between natural events and the trials, and the reason is that civil protection is better than in the past, and so people wants to protect more protection, and so the judge receive that request and a search of responsibilities of the events and so on. But which is the question? Can you repeat, Marco?
If and how this can be used to actually increase the cultural awareness there is an element of awareness increasing because people expect more protection. So if other partners are actually using this to actually do other initiatives to further increase the awareness, both within judiciary but also beyond.
Yes, also, oh, yes. Yes, we can use this data. It's difficult to speak about that, but we can use this data to talk about judge and to talk about people. It's the best. It's most important to talk about people and to involve them in this discussion because population wants to protect, but they didn't know the risk and the dangers that they create or they occurs. And so it's important to talk about that and to talk about the prevention, also not only with the judge, but also with the population.
Right, well, thank you. That concludes our session this morning. Thank you very much to our wonderful presenters. They've certainly set the scene for a great day today. Could we give them another round of applause, please?